discovering complexity in my life is that I didn't eat it until too late. That, as you know, in 1993, I was finishing a dissertation in 1992, and a certain dissertation advisor of mine, Bill Limsat, said at some point rather late in the game, well, you probably should talk to Bob and Bill, but I had a baby at the time, and so then I finally read it like 3 years later, and I'm like, oops, that would have been really helpful. And it has continued to be helpful. But okay, that's my story about Bob. Pleased here to have Cédric Brun from the Université de Bordeaux, Montaigne, and he's going to talk about, I'm so glad that someone here is going to talk about Descartes. We just owe so much, both good and bad.
Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you, Stuart. So, as Stuart said, I'm working at the philosophy department in Bordeaux, Montaigne University, but I'm also leading a research team within a neurolab in Bordeaux. And before anything else, I want to express my immense gratitude to Tom for inviting me here, especially because I think I met only once Bob, like 8 years ago, and we're not really close. I mean, if I compare to anyone that has been speaking so far, I'm probably the one who knows him least personally. However, his work, and in particular the book, Discovering Complexity with Bill, has had a very important role in my conversion from philosophy of mind to philosophy of neuroscience. Basically, this book made me realize that the kind of philosophy I had learned to do often turned out to be sterile when it came to scientists. Attention to scientific practices, to the way in which problems are formulated, method elaborated, and tools, whether conceptual, formal, or material, conceived and manipulated by scientists, were the key to a philosophy otherwise doomed to become a form of neo-scholasticism. So for this and for the generosity of your mentoring that, I mean, apparently shows through all the great talk we had these two days, I want to thank you, Bob, and in a way, Bill too. So without further ado, let's move on to my presentation. Its title is somewhat misleading or deceitful, and it needs a word of explanation. The answer to this question is localizationism, a Cartesian inheritance, seems so trivial that the question itself probably shouldn't be taken literally. Well, of course not. Of course not. Of course, Descartes did not defend the idea that a specific cognitive function is localized in a specific structure of the brain. Even the animal spirit's mechanistic understanding of the neurophysiological processes of sensory motor activities does not qualify as a localizationist view. John Sutton, among other Descartes scholars, has made this part, I think, clear enough, and has been discussing this point for the last 30 years. However, the way in which contemporary philosophical or theoretical positions are referred to Descartes and his doctrines can be evidence that there is something common among those positions. Of course, I don't deny that there can be a purely rhetorical use of these references, as shown by many early modern scholars examining claims of affiliation from contemporary philosophers to past ones. But the way Descartes is alternatively considered as the supervillain of the philosophy of mind, the one whose metaphysical dogmatism is seen as the source of the mind-body problem because of his substance dualism, or as the herald of the 17th century mechanistic and therefore materialist neurophysiology of perception, imagination, or motor control. Tells us more about contemporary positions than the historical relevance of these claims. Indeed, the relevance of this answer depends essentially on two things: what is meant by the notion of Cartesian inheritance and what precisely is meant by the concept of localization. The objective of my presentation is to explain in what sense localizationism is not a result of Cartesian influence, and to demonstrate that despite this, the practice of localization, functional localization in neuroscience, still exhibits a significant Cartesian influence. So this influence is often overlooked in the historical section of introductory neurosciences course, for example, but it is nonetheless deeper and more interesting than is commonly recognized by neuroscientists themselves. Okay, so here is the outline of what I'm going to present, and given the time, I'll try to pack everything. So I gave a very broad and general definition of localizationism, then sketch the important distinction offered by Bill and Bob in their 1993 book, Discovering Complexity, between localizationism, close to what they call simple or direct localization, that's what I take, and localization strategy, complex or indirect localization in the book. Then I will examine a set of assumptions guiding localizationism according to a recent paper by Westlin and colleagues. And I will show that these assumptions are methodologically constrained in the localization strategy, and therefore gives us an interesting point of view on how to deal with this tension between localizationism and localization. Then I'll examine a set of objections of different kinds raised against localizationism. We'll see that I'll go pretty quick on this. Can go by on this during the Q&A. And finally, I'll show how the localization strategy is inherently depending on the mechanistic nature of the main research program of cognitive and behavioral neuroscience, which will lead me to my conclusion that the Cartesian inheritance lies in the dynamics of cognitive neuroscience practice rather than in a supposed doctrinal adherence to localizationism. Right. So here is my attempt to define localizationism. In the context of cognitive and behavioral neuroscience, localizationism refers to the idea that specific cognitive functions are associated with specific regions or structures or circuits in the brain. This view suggests that different mental processes, such as language, memory, or perception, can be mapped to specific areas of the brain, and that these areas are responsible for carrying out those functions. When I say carrying out, it's just because I want to be as vague as possible on the causal relationship or dependence relationship or emergence relationship between the two. So you have this kind of picture in most of the textbooks in neuroscience, even nowadays. And while you have this kind of pictures and description, there is this idea that I take from Dawkins that was about reductionism, but I think it can also bear on localizationism, which is that I think localizationism is one of the things like sin that is only mentioned by people who are against it. Which is another way to say that localizationism is bad. It's bad. It's supposed to be bad. Okay, this position, localizationism, has raised objection in various kinds, a priori, methodological, theoretical, and empirical ones, that we will review in a minute, but it can be considered as one of the dominant approaches structuring the field of behavioral and cognitive neuroscience for the last century and a half, even before cognitive neuroscience existed per se. If the debate about localizationism has contributed to qualify its claim, it remains deeply rooted in the practice and teaching of neuroscience. Not to mention, and I think that could be related to what Carrie presented this morning, not to mention the dissemination of neuroscientific findings to the public, where this kind of localizationism is very, very, very strong in the public outreach of neuroscience, for the better or for the worse. It is worth noting that localizationism is distinct from the historical attempt to link the soul to the brain as a unified entity. This concept of global localization can be traced back to ancient Greek thinker and is not particularly relevant to our present issue. So I will not get into that today. Okay. I will not enter the detail of the history of the diverse anatomic discoveries about the nervous system. I rather want to focus on the tools used by neurophysiologists to identify structures in the brain that are linked to psychological function. Obviously, among the methods and tools, well, the three main tools and methodology that were used since the beginning of the 19th century, end of the 18th century, all share this idea that we are trying to locate in the brain some aspect of the realization or the background of a psychological function. Whether we take into account neuroanatomopathology, like in Broca's anatomo-clinical cases or Florence Lejeune stories on non-human animals, or the subtractive method that has been refined and is still used and refined nowadays, or any kind of stimulation methods, even from the beginning of the 19th century, all of these methods do share the idea that we should try to locate in the brain some aspect of the realization of a psychological function. In a recent opinion piece published in Trends in Cognitive Science, Westlin and her colleagues argue in favor of a re-evaluation of the localization strategy guiding the current state of research practice in cognitive and behavioral neuroscience. They review three questionable assumptions whose reconsideration may offer, they say, opportunities for a more robust and replicable cognitive neuroscience. The first is the localization assumption. That is the idea that instances of a category that constitutes a category of psychological events, for example, instances of fear, are assumed to be caused by a single dedicated psychological process implemented in a dedicated neural ensemble. So that's the first assumption they attribute to the methodology in neuroscience. We'll go further on assessing this claim. The one-to-one assumption is the second way, the second assumption that they isolate. The idea is that the dedicated neural ensemble is assumed to map uniquely to that psychological category, such that the mapping generalizes across contexts, people, measurement strategies, and experimental designs. And finally, the third assumption is the independence assumption, the idea that the dedicated neural ensemble is thought to function independently of contextual factors, such as the rest of the brain, the body, and the surrounding world. So the ensemble can be studied alone without concern for those other factors. Contextual factors might moderate activity in the neural ensemble, but should not fundamentally change its mapping for the instances of a psychological category. Okay, so that's the kind of landscape that we still nowadays have about this accusation of neuroscience to be localizationist. Well, here are the objections to the localizationism in general. So you have the classical a priori objection, the merological fallacy that you can find in Bennett and Hacker, for example, where they say the brain is not a logically appropriate subject for psychological predicates. So if they're not, then the brain a function cannot be in the brain. Then there is also this idea developed by Uthal in the new phrenology, where it says, clearly, if what one seeks to localize is itself nebulous and ill-defined, finding a particular brain locus in which it is uniquely or even partially represented is going to pose a considerable challenge. A challenge fraught with its own conceptual, technical, and logical difficulties. Basically, this idea relies exactly on the same. These two objections rely on the same assumption, with which there are two different categories of things. Then you cannot just ascribe them to you cannot ascribe to them the same properties. Then there is another way to see the merological objection, which is not from an a priori point of view, but from a methodological one. When you look at, for example, projects like the Human Brain Project or the Blue Brain Project or any other kind of approach that view the brain as a whole and in which complex network theory, for example, will play a very important role, then you cannot understand the mind-brain relationship as a discrete set of mechanisms. You have to take into account the general complex, temporally and spatially multiscale structure that give rise to elaborate molecular, cellular, and neuronal phenomena that together form the physical and biological basis of cognition, as Bassett and Gazzaniga said in 2011. So obviously, even neuroscientists do not adhere to the kind of presuppositions that or assumption that we mentioned earlier. Also, from a theoretical point of view, you can object to localizationism that, for example, the evolutionary objection to localizationism say that, okay, these neural structures are the product of evolution and natural selection. And of course, they have specialized. They can have progressively been dedicated to meet some environmental or biological challenge. But in that sense, there is no way, or it's too simplistic to think that there should be a straightforward pathway in the history of evolution to map one function with one structure. Structures have been reattributed. We've heard about exaptation, for example, and it makes perfectly sense that in the process of evolutionary history, structures have had different function or have realized different function. Finally, there are empirical objections, and I take Westlin and colleagues, also as well as Anderson, as example, when they say functional neuroimaging methods were designed to reveal the unique neural locations for different mental phenomena. Decades of study ironically produced evidence for the opposite. Localized neural computations contribute to a range of phenomena, and several key studies suggest that psychological phenomena like attention and vision might be better modeled as whole brain events. Okay. For instance, although Broca's area has been strongly associated with language processing, it turns out to also be involved in many different actions and imagery-related tasks, including movement preparation, action sequencing, action recognition, imagery of human motion, and action imitation. Similarly, for example, visual and motor areas, long presumed to be among the most highly specialized in the brain, have been shown to be active in various sorts of language processing and other higher cognitive tasks. Um, um, Excitement over the discovery of the fusiform face area, for example, was quickly tempered when it was discovered that the area also responded to cars, birds, and other stimuli. So the ensuing debates over the real function of these areas have still not been resolved, and I'm not intending to resolve it, of course. And in light of these results, researchers have started to question the boundaries between psychological domains, one thought separate and distinct, such as perception and cognition and emotion, for example. So, of course, we can straightforwardly imagine some answers or some responses to these objections. So the first, I think, would be that localization of function and context independence of functional selectivity are not assumptions, but just empirical hypotheses. It does not advance science to replace them with opposite assumptions. Rather, we should test whether these hypotheses hold against data. On another hand, the claim has never been that a particular mental process engages only with a single brain region. Rather, the claim is that many individual brain regions are engaged in single mental processes. The evidence for example, the functional specificity of many individual brain regions has been replicated in hundreds of studies in dozens of labs using every methods in cognitive science. So it's some kind of robust result of neuroscience. And the functional selectivity of these brain regions does not suffer from a replicability crisis so far. So, in fact, it looks like there is some issues even nowadays in the way the framework of the criticizing of localizationism has been used. So now, if we take seriously the idea that there is a difference between localizationism and the localization strategy, and if we agree that Descartes' position is not about localizationism, it's not about localizing a specific structure, in a specific structure, a specific function, how do we understand how the localization strategy descends from Cartesianism? So, as a prominent figure in the history of philosophy and science, Descartes is often cited as a reference point, either to align oneself with his legacy or to differentiate oneself from his positions. This use of historical references is frequent and aims at some kind of rhetorical impact, especially when referring to a figure of such high renown. In the course of my teaching activities, and I suppose most of yours, I have offered introductory courses in the philosophy of mind and the history of brain science to various audiences, including students specializing in philosophy, cognitive science, medicine, and biology. Through this experience, I have observed my colleagues in philosophy and in neuroscience, and I've reviewed several textbooks used to teach these topics, and I was struck by the role that Descartes is given in these introductory texts. Although he is generally considered like the supervillain of the philosophy of mind, that, as I told you, He's also presented as the founding father of neurophysiology. And this paradoxical role given to Descartes and to Descartes' natural philosophy and metaphysics has been noted by many. And this is because of his theory of the reflex arc and his ambition articulated in his treatise on the world to offer a mechanistic conception of perception, imagination, memory, and other cognitive functions based on his theory of animal spirits. The use of Cartesian tutelage as both the supervillain of substance dualism and the herald of neurophysiological mechanism can be understood as the sign of a fundamental philosophical tension in Descartes' work, tension that reflects on the current state of the debate between localizationism and localization strategy. So, of course, Descartes is seen as the one who located the seat of the soul within the pineal gland, the H gland, as he calls it in Traité du Monde. However, his account of sensory, motor, and higher cognitive functions by means of animal spirits does not end at putting this gland in motion. Basically, the idea of his understanding and his theory of the animal spirit is about the constant dynamics of the relationship between the body, the entire body of the subject, and its brain and mind. So let's look at this. Why did Descartes really want to get any knowledge about the brain and body? What does it aims at? Well, basically, it pursues two purposes. One is establishing a medical principles which will help nurture good health for as many human as possible. That's the general take on the discours de la méthode, where he says se rendre comme maître et possesseur de la nature, being like a master and owner of nature. Medicine is seen as the principal fruit of the tree of knowledge. On the other hand, this project of getting a good understanding of the brain and body is about getting to know the body we have as our own body, which is not, as Descartes says, we're not as a pilot in a ship. We're not homunculus in our bodies. Body and soul, body and mind are intimately bounded together, and that's the idea of the unity or the unified human nature in Descartes, and this is in itself a goal that is pursued by Descartes within the Traité du Monde and especially in the Traité de l'Homme. So the biological machine that he described in the Traité du Monde are not just conventional clocks and simple automata. Human and animal bodies are neither passive. Sorry?
We're filming something first.
Yeah, sure. Close the door. Sorry. So this means that so let me collect my thoughts. Didn't expect that. Okay. Right. So the physiological framework that in which Descartes is pushing his inquiry necessitates attention to specific individual bodies rather than treating them as anonymous entities. He's working on his own body, I mean, the body of the subject, my body, my own body. Despite aspiring to master one's own body as a natural philosopher, it remains elusive to control due to its fluctuating nature and indistinct boundaries. While one may strive to possess their body, this endeavor essentially entails an unending focus on the ever-changing effects of its internal patterns with the genuine causes eluding detection. So basically this idea is that we're, of course, it takes the image of cogs and automatas and clocks, but it also very clearly specifies that. So that's a translation I gave of the Traité du Monde, when it says, we see clocks, artificial fountains, mills, and other similar machines, which being made only by men, do not fail to have the strength to move themselves in many different ways. And it seems to me that I cannot imagine so many kinds of movement in this one, which I suppose to be made by the hands of God, nor attribute to it so much artifice that you do not have reason to think that there may be even more. I'm sorry, I mean, that's Descartes. So you have three different negation, and you have to make sense of it. But basically what he says, so I'm translating again my own translation. What he says is that when he uses this image of clock, fountains, and mill as an image of the body, what we see is, in fact, is that no animal, human or non-human, is ever as simple as the kind of organization that we see in our clocks, mills, and fountains. Because God put in this specific relation between my soul and my body is precisely the fact that we have this degree of freedom of use and this degree of complexity of organization within our bodies that does not stop to the kind of mechanical limitation that clocks and mills and fountains have. So in this sense, the mechanistic or the mechanism in Descartes, of course, cannot be just simply the realization of this program of treating every organism as a pure machine. Machines are analogies to understand the way a complex system is working. And that's where I think we find back the idea of how mechanistic approach or mechanism can be interesting for understanding something that is not a stricto sensu mechanism. So I'm almost done. What this means is that when Descartes in the Traité de l'Homme is trying to localize where flux of animal spirit converge is a necessary condition of giving any kind of explanatory account of perception, memory, imagination, since these functions are not specific to the human animal. And you remember, I suppose, that animals are complex machines. Organisms are complex machines in the sense that I have just specified. However, this localization does not amount to localizing the function itself, since the soul mind is not an homunculus in the body, and that we as humans are this connection between two systems that are complex. Okay. Finally, when Bob and Bill explain their understanding of how mechanism and the decompose and localized strategy works, what I understand, at least, is that precisely because we are facing a complex system, we need to start somewhere. We need to start somewhere, and in starting somewhere, one of the words that is important is somewhere. We need to have some grasp on the complexity in order to unfold it. So localization, whether within a bottom-up strategy or in a top-down strategy, has to start by specifying the handle through which we are transforming the complexity of the organism within its biological and psychological life in this heuristic tool that we can act on or act upon. We'll go back maybe on this. So to concluding, sorry, questions for future work. To finish, so take-home message. Localization is not a Cartesian inheritance. I think that's clear. Localization strategy can be seen as a Cartesian inheritance specifically because the kind of mechanism that Descartes was promoting and doing is precisely the kind that we still have in mind, as it has been very well said by many in this very room. Question still is, do we have now a way to reconcile mechanism and dynamicist embodied cognitive, which I think was key to Descartes' ambition, as I think I tried to gesture to. And finally, how does the Human Connectome project, which is a side project for me, something I want to work on, aligns with the mechanistic framework that is at the core of cognitive and behavioral neuroscience? And why am I asking this now? Just because the kind of answer or objection coming from the holistic HPP approach to neuroscience is nowadays, well-funded to start, has some kind of audience far from the core center of neuroscience within AI, within mathematics, and within cognitive science. While I have seen no progress in terms of explanation, in terms of discoveries coming from this side. So my question is, what purpose is serving this kind of holistic project if they don't deliver? So thank you for your attention, and many thanks to you all.
Colin, thank you for those pictures. So we got 25 minutes or a little more maybe for questions. So, Bob.
Nice talk.
Thank you.
You might be surprised to find out I also love Descartes a lot.
There we go.
You might be surprised to find out I also love Descartes.
I'm not.
I do.
I'm not surprised.
Right there.
Good mouse.
Go down. Yeah. Okay, you might be surprised to find out I love Descartes. I agree that he's not a localizationist. I'm going to agree with things first, and then
Yeah, sure.
if you want a resource, philosophical resource that treats him as an improved, sadly, it's all church and syllable.
It's
All church and syllable. He is the standard Descartes that occurs in neuroscience textbook. Now, what about Descartes? what I think is true is that he's still a mechanism, of course. And in the moment, for example, when he explores the limits of mechanism, including in physiology, he starts out by explicitly saying, "I'm going to ignore the mind now." Right? I'm just doing a mechanistic story. See, how far can I take it? How far can I push this program? I think that fits with your version. We got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Where did it get though? When he says, "I'm not lodged in my body as a pilot of a ship," in Meditation 6, I think he means that. And what that means, that for me, the way I take it at least, is that he has to tell a story about mind, the emotions in this case, the passions of the soul. Is the right book.
Yeah.
And he tells a story about the passions of the soul, where those passions are attributes of a complex substance. They're not attributes of either mind or body, but of the two together, which makes it a kind of soul, it a kind of person, individual. And I think that's the view that he defends with Princess Elizabeth as well.
Yep.
So he dismisses the idea that you're going to treat this as normal mechanical causation across the ideal plane, and thinks there's a story about the unity of mind and body, which makes him not a localizationist, not a methodist when it comes to the plane, but a dualist of a more interesting sort that it really is portrayed. Because, for example, animals don't have, this shows up in some of these letters too, animals don't have the attributes of mind that humans do.
Some.
He thinks.
Yeah.
Some don't.
Some.
And maybe that's a scandal, that's what some people call it. But he does think that the mind and body are unified, and he does think they interact by a kind of Aristotelian causation. Right? It's not causation by push.
Yep.
It's the correct application for our concept of gravity. It changes things without pushing them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a better picture of Descartes, I think.
Yeah.
Than the standard. And
well,
it's not localizationist, but it is mechanistic with respect to the world and the body.
Yeah.
Not the person.
Yeah. So I totally agree with you, and I didn't want to get into the union aspect because it was going to change the scope of what I wanted to stress today. But I totally agree with you on the basic idea, and that's where metaphysics comes back. However, part of the project of the Traité du Monde is to show that animals, whether human or non-human, have the resources, material, mechanical, or mechanistic resources, to show some aspect of mental life that we thought was not possible without a soul. When I say we thought, means Aristotelian thought. Because I mean, we all have to keep in mind that the target of Descartes, wherever you look at in his work, is just to destroy Aristotelianism as a theory of mind, body, whatever. I mean, destroy Aristotelianism. So, giving the animals memory, imagination, perception, and somehow will, that's a debatable question, but was something that could rely on mechanistic explanation or mechanistic background, without attributing them anything like a soul or the ability to have a rational mind or whatever. So
I agree.
so in this sense, I agree with you that the unity of the man, that is its soul and its body, is central. But what interested me here was that this localization strategy that you've identified within the mechanistic movement or strategy in general can totally be linked to what Descartes was doing in these treatises, which is, of course, in tension, but that's the particularity of Descartes' philosophy. The tension is everywhere in Descartes' philosophy between its metaphysics, its methodology, science. Its natural philosophy methodology, and is practical philosophy or practical theory. In
Localization aside, do you see him as a methodist?
sorry,
Like localization aside, in what sense is he a methodist?
in what sense is he a mechanist? In general, or just in the Traité du Monde?
In the Trinity. What interests this is Peter Mockler believes he
Yeah.
is. I don't. But I think you make an interesting case. He isn't.
Well,
Exactly.
I think he is, just because he's trying to figure out ways of explaining some psychological functions or mental functions through the resources of things that are bodies, because animal spirits are nothing but bodies. And the entire ontological, epistemological resources that you can rely on are those of the mechanics of the 17th century, corpuscular mechanists, or geometrical mechanism, or is fluid mechanism, since that's the kind of general worldview he had on physics. So I would say that this kind of flux of animal spirits and this kind of movement by proximity physics in Descartes are all the resources that he relies on in the Traité du Monde to explain this kind of cognitive or psychological functions. It doesn't say much of the union and of the passions and the ability to formulate any rational thoughts, but that's another
One
aspect.
last little thought. I think that's good. He may be. It's all. No, I agree that he's not a localizationist. He may be a methodist, at least with respect to soul things, not the passions, but the other things. The way I think to connect him to localization is right through the 19th century.
Yeah.
With the rise of phrenology, and right into Broca, who's claimed to be a phrenologist. And there you have pure localization.
Yeah.
So there is a way in. It's just going to be an interesting historical excursion.
No. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to come off Bob's comment, and first to tell everyone that Bob doesn't just like Descartes, but he's published on Descartes.
Yeah.
His very position of trialism. So once again, kudos. But I wonder if there's a different sense of localization that is interesting in Descartes. And I guess I'll set it up this way. And another requirement that the cognitive theory, mechanistic theory is supposed to deliver us is the epistemology,
Yeah.
in a sense. So it's the idea that we could be radically wrong about what the world is like, right? And as you point out, that's contra the prevailing Aristotelian view that doesn't allow for that much mismatch
Yep.
between us and the world, because our mental contents are literally the same as the thing that exists out in the world. They're just in a different place, in a different matter, according to some theories. So that's in physical matter, but the idea of Tony is in my head in intellectual matter, but it's the very same thing. Tony's not a good example. A fraud, because I don't really understand Tony. But a fraud, right? The frog in the world is the same as the frog in my head, just in different matters, so to speak. And in that sense, there is something interestingly local, because the claim is the only place where mental contents exist is in our minds, and that's it. And the world is a completely different story in a completely different vocabulary. And I think that is an interesting localization.
Yeah.
Against which people may rebel later on, but yeah.
Although, thank you. I think you're right. That's one way also of speaking about localization in Descartes. Although, again, I didn't want to go into the status of the idea as an epistemological tool or epistemological role in Descartes. I mean, the debate about the nature of ideas in the 17th century, whether they are representative of the reality and then therefore being a kind of veil between my mind and the world, or if they are the act through which I grasp reality, which is another way of saying that I perceive directly the idea or the world through the idea or via the idea. So all this debate is also about localization. Where do you locate this common ground between the world and my mind in order to get some knowledge of it? So I would totally agree with that, but that would be a very different talk and an issue. But so although I may wonder, and I have had these discussions with for example, John Locke scholars at other times in my career. I may wonder if we're not, in a way, pushing our own question too far when trying to relate to this, because at some point when I looked at the amount of scholarship on Descartes that has been written in the last 200 years, when we look at the details of the issues that were behind the curtains of Descartes' discussion of the union between soul and body, for example, or on the status of ideas, or on the directness or indirectness of perception. So there were theological issues. There were moral issues. There were physiological issues, and all these are connected to each other without us being completely competent to say, well, where does the border set? So I agree with you. There are so many ways in which localization could be also treated. But if I want to be consistent with the question of localizationism, that is the question of functions, then I had to keep in track here.
Carl, do you have one?
Yeah, unless somebody else has. I'm scared to find this a very basic question. I was surprised to see memory on the body side of things. And
well,
given what Zvi just said, I was surprised. He doesn't think that memory is a form of thinking, I suppose. And so can you just help me charitably to understand?
That's the most complicated and absurd piece of neuropsychology or neurophysiology in Descartes. So, in the Traité de l'Homme, within the Traité du Monde, you have this moment where, so you remember the schema of the H gland, the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is this little gland that is so small that it can be moved by the spirit animals. But when moving, then it touches another part of the brain just behind it, and it literally imprints memories in the brain. And that's common to all animals that have a brain, let's say. So animals can have memory. And I mean, it has these pages about, well, of course they have memories. I mean, my horse remembers me. Okay, he remembers the way to the stable. So they have memory, but what they do not have is a soul. And the thing is that this engraving or imprint in the brain, because it has, if you take into account the fact that everything is flux in Descartes' natural philosophy, then how does something stays in something that is in flux? So there has to be an imprint. There has to be this flux, this permanent flux of animal spirits. And then you have to have this relationship between the flux, the imprint, and the soul, sorry. And that's what brings us the kind of imagination we have. Imagination is, for Descartes, I mean, the theory of imagination of Descartes is a brilliant piece, I think, of philosophical psychology. So imagination is memory put forward, which is, I mean, I think it's a wonderful way of defining imagination or creativity or any kind of non-chat GPT creativity. So in this sense, that's what they lack, animals. Doesn't mean they can plan, because he says something about planning action or behavior, but that's on a different scale. But that would be my answer. We should go to the text, but that would be painful. Yeah.
Sorry, just one clarifying question. Would you mind going back a slide?
Sure.
It might have been a slide before, but it's not super important. Did you, and I might have caught this wrong, did you mention that localization is different from decomposition?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's what Bill and Bob said in the 93 book, that they are linked, but they're different aspect of the grasping of complexity. That they are necessary steps toward grasping this complexity and putting it into form, I would say, to understand what's going on in a complex world or in a complex organism. But I don't want to force anything. I mean, they're here, so they can answer. They can speak for themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. If we're done, there is coffee. Apparently.
Well,
So, anything else? Okay. Well, thank you.
thank you very much.